Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into Chapter 14 of the book, Perverting Our Reproductive Nature, which is titled Sex Education from Innocence to Indulgence. We're going to impartially unpack the author's overarching critique of modern sex education. Basically, we'll explore the book's argument that what happens in the classroom has completely shifted away from objective, biological instruction and moved toward this highly subjective, ideological exploration. We've got a lot of history, psychology, and cultural impact to cover, so let's get right into it. Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with the education shift, move into how ideology replaces biology, and then explore the resulting loss of innocence. After that, we'll look at numbness and desensitization, the crisis of identity, and wrap up with the author's proposed solution, reclaiming design and meaning. Starting with Part 1, the education shift, where we zoom out on the cultural ripple effect. To really grasp what the author is saying in this chapter, we have to look at the big picture they've been building. If you've been following along, you'll remember the author draws this fascinating direct line through history. In earlier chapters, we talked about how the era of birth control technologically severed sex from its natural biological consequence, which is reproduction. Then we moved into the era of pornography, which severed sex from relationship and intimacy. Now, the author argues we're in a third phase. Modern sex education is acting as this new catalyst, completely severing intimacy from innocence and meaning, right inside the classroom. That brings us to Part 2, Ideology Replaces Biology. Let's talk about the specific curriculum changes happening in the classroom. The core observation here is that sex education doesn't just begin and end with clinical biology anymore. Back in the mid-20th century, the approach was very clinical, right? It was tethered to physical reality, heavily focused on anatomy and basic public health. Today, though, the book characterizes modern sex ed as an ideological pivot toward exploring subjective identities and fluid boundaries. The author's arguing that this isn't just a simple update to the vocabulary we use. It is a profound, fundamental shift in how we are actually teaching young people to understand reality itself. So, how did the shift actually happen? Well, the book points to some specific historical frameworks, heavily focusing on Keynesian theory. This is the ideological premise that children are sexual beings right from birth. According to the author, figures like Alfred Kinsey and later organizations like Planned Parenthood were the primary catalysts for pushing this theory into modern schooling. The critique here is that under this framework, childhood modesty isn't viewed as a natural developmental norm that we should protect. Instead, it's treated as an outdated taboo that needs to be dismantled through early sexual instruction. Moving to Part 3, the loss of innocence, focusing on exposing the underdeveloped mind. The author makes a really strong case that handing explicit concepts to kids too early doesn't empower them at all. To back this up, the book brings in perspectives from medical professionals. Take Dr. Miriam Grossman, a child and adolescent psychiatrist. She pulls no punches, stating, "Our kids are being raised in a culture that is sexually obsessed, morally confused, and biologically ignorant." The author uses her critique to drive home the point that modern curricula completely ignore the emotional and psychological weight of sexual behavior, which ultimately leaves children incredibly vulnerable. To put that vulnerability into perspective, we have to look at the brain. The prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that governs impulse control and long-term decision-making. And here's the kicker. It doesn't fully mature until we're in our mid-20s. The book points out this massive clash between what's being taught and basic human biology. The assertion is that handing children these heavy, complex ideological concepts totally ignores brain development and effectively robs them of the time and space to just, be kids. The text also leans on the perspective of journalist Abigail Schreier. She observes that the education system hasn't just introduced children to adult topics, it has invited them to construct their identities around them. The author uses Schreier's perspective to highlight a really concerning trend. Modern education is encouraging kids to build their foundational sense of self on these very fluid, subjective emotional impulses rather than objective reality, way before they even have the cognitive maturity to process what any of that actually means. Which brings us to Part 4, Numbness and Desensitization. Let's look at the emotional blunting that happens in such a saturated culture. The author claims that when a culture makes absolutely everything casual, especially things that historically were treated as deeply private or even sacred, it doesn't lead to enlightenment. The book asserts that repeated exposure to sexual content doesn't create wisdom. It creates psychological erosion and emotional blunting. Think about it. When nothing is off limits, children lose that vital ability to tell the difference between what's intimately private and what is just a public performance. They end up overstimulated by the mechanics of it all, but emotionally stunted because they don't have the moral architecture to make sense of it. The author actually labels this the desensitization process. It's this systematic reframing of our natural protective boundaries. Suddenly, shame is labeled as regressive. Modesty is called oppressive. Even natural discomfort is just written off as ignorance. The author believes that systematically dismantling these protective instincts leaves young people feeling a whole lot of nothing. It basically turns down the volume on reverence until all that's left is white noise. Next up is Part 5, the crisis of identity and the questioning of biological reality. So what happens when you untether young minds from biological reality? The author identifies a severe psychological fallout. We're talking about rising anxiety and depression, profound identity confusion, emotional detachment, and this really deep-seated distrust of our innate biological design. The argument here is that when education tells students their biological blueprint is secondary to their subjective feelings, confusion just rushes in to fill that vacuum right when these kids need stability the most. To really punctuate this point, the text turns back to Abigail Schreier. She warns, "We are raising a generation to believe that any discomfort they feel in their body is evidence of a design flaw." The author shares this warning to point out how completely normal adolescent awkwardness and discomfort, things that historically were just seen as phases you grow through, are now frequently framed by educators as red flags that require medical or ideological intervention. Finally, we reach Part 6, Reclaiming Design and Meaning, where the author talks about returning to the foundational blueprint. After laying out all these severe critiques, the author doesn't just leave us hanging. The proposed solution is to return to the concept of design. By rejecting design, the author argues, we create a cultural vacuum that gets filled by ideology, treating bodies like they're just plastic and reducing intimacy to mere recreation. But by honoring design, we get essential structure. The book argues that returning to this foundational blueprint binds intimacy back together with unity, purpose, and the sacred bond of humanity. It gives kids something real and steady to hold on to, rather than just drowning them in excess information. Which leaves us with this final, provocative question to ponder. What happens when a generation is taught to distrust its own design? We've seen how this chapter really pushes the book's broader thesis forward, showing how from birth control to pornography and now to the modern classroom, severing our reproductive nature from its original design carries some incredibly profound consequences. As we move toward later chapters in this explainer series, I want you to keep this growing tension between biology and ideology in mind. If you want to dive deeper into these concepts and support the author, be sure to visit the interactive companion site at pervertingourreproductivenature.com.